Hello, my name is Kai, and welcome to the Theoretical YouTube channel, where I believe that this is one of the most useful items ever created in fiction. Sure, there's things like lightsabers that can cut through anything, magic wands that can do practically anything, teleportation devices that can go anywhere, time machines that can go any when, but you know what's even better than a lightsaber? 50 lightsabers. I might even go as far as to say that's 50 times better. No, that's definitely a situation where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Whatever you want to call it, a bag of holding in D&D, a hoi poi capsule in Dragon Ball, Mary Poppins bag, Merlin's bag, Hermione's bag, Rico, these things are all ridiculously useful. You can conceivably fit whatever you want in them, and just carry it wherever you want to go. I mean, I know there's limitations as to what you can actually fit in the bag, like 50 lightsabers might be no problem, but a whole teleportation device or time machine is a bit far-fetched, right? In fact, I retract my statement. Bags of holding are nothing compared to the TARDIS. It's a giant bag of holding and, also the most overpowered car. It's also alive, so that's a bonus. Any way you look at it, bags of holding are a very popular device in fiction, and yet to this day I've never really seen a good explanation as to how one might work. Usually it's just something like a portal to a pocket dimension, and while that might work for some things like D&D, where those are actually pretty well established and used elsewhere in the canon, for something like Harry Potter, where it's used so often, Hermione's bag, Newt's briefcase, the tents at the Quidditch World Cup, the Ford Angela, and the Sorting Hat, among others, it's so ill-defined, and yet I think I have another explanation. So today I try to explain. Okay, before I get into how I think these things actually work, I want to make it clear that extra planes of existence or another spatial dimension are perfectly good interpretations. I actually think that they are the correct interpretation for a lot of these things. In fact, the official term, hammer space, lends itself quite nicely to extra-dimensional explanations. The idea behind hammer space is that it's an extra-dimensional storage area that is instantly accessible by some or all characters in a story. Thus, Spider-Ham is able to pull a hammer out of nowhere, but the other characters cannot. But characters don't usually go into hammer space, they just pull things out of it. Also, since hammer space is another dimension, that means that the only access to it is through a portal, like a door, the opening in a bag, or just a portal that a character makes to reach into at any given time. But this is not necessarily the case in Harry Potter, since we can hear sounds from the outside world that don't just come through the door, and we can see sunlight coming through all sides of the tent. So what is going on here? Well, I suppose there are three possibilities. The first is hammer space, another dimension that they're just going into, where there is just more space to store stuff. But we've already ruled this one out. The second is that when things are going into one of these objects, they are being shrunken down, and when they come out, they are enlarged again. Kind of like the laboratory in Ant-Man and the Wasp, except this would be a more passive process, instead of just growing and shrinking it whenever you please. This has some merit in the Harry Potter universe, since we do see magical creatures going in and out of Newt's case, and they do seem to shrink and grow as they do so. However, this would mean that the opening of the case from the inside would look a lot bigger than it does from the outside. But it doesn't. We see that it looks just about the same size, and likewise with the tent at the Quidditch World Cup. Okay, actually we don't get a very good look at the door from the inside, but Occam's razor, I have less to prove than you. Additionally, the spell used here is called an extension charm, which doesn't sound a whole lot like shrinking. If it was, then it would be some modification of Reduso, or perhaps a shrinking solution around the edge. I think that Newt does have one of these in addition, so he's able to fit something the size of an erumpent through the opening. The third option is what I personally think it is, and will thus be the main topic of this video. Hey, I see that. Well, sadly, not only am I just getting into the explanation, but this is also where most people will start to click off of the video, because the next bit is confusing and has a lot of math. But don't worry, the most you'll need to know is, what an angle is, and the rest I'll explain. And there'll be pictures. Alright, the basic idea behind this is called hyperbolic space, a topic that math people love to talk about. Seriously, if you're ever in a conversation with a mathematician, especially one that specializes in geometry, just bring up any sort of hyperbolic or non-Euclidean space, they'll go crazy for it. It's like giving goldfish to... well, I guess anyone. Everyone loves goldfish. Hyperbolic space is basically a completely different way of organizing the universe, but that's a bit daunting, so let's first try to understand how we normally organize it. Euclidean space. Euclidean space is how you would normally imagine the world. Look around the room, the phone or computer you're on, the chair you're sitting in, the old pizza box that you know you should have gotten rid of days ago, but it won't fit in the trash, so you'll have to take it all the way out to the bin, and you'll do that when it's convenient. They're all Euclidean. But what does that actually mean? Euclidean, non-Euclidean, procrastination? There are essentially three types of space: spherical space, Euclidean space, and hyperbolic space. The difference between the three spaces is how much space you can fit into any given amount of space. There's gotta be a better way to say that. Imagine a normal flat 2x2 plane. How could we fit more or less space in there? Shouldn't it just always be 4? Well, yes and no. Definitely in Euclidean space. Remember, everything you've ever learned will certainly apply to Euclidean space. Unless it's just wrong. The way we define how much space can fit into any particular area is sort of like how many degrees there are around any point. We all know that in Euclidean there are 360 degrees around a point, but in the other two, that's not really the case. There are actually less degrees around a point in spherical geometry, and more in hyperbolic geometry. So what does that entail? Well, imagine a point on the 2D plane. How many squares can we get to touch that one point? It's not a trick question, the answer is 4. 4 squares can fit around any point in a two-dimensional plane. Now, how many hexagons can you fit around that point? 3. And how many equilateral triangles can you fit around that point? 6. Squares, hexagons, and equilateral triangles are the only polygons that can perfectly cover a Euclidean plane forever by themselves. This is called tessellation, and there are plenty of shapes that can do it. You've probably seen those birds that N.C. Escher drew, but those aren't polygons. There are also plenty of combinations of polygons that can do this, but squares, hexagons, and triangles are the only ones that can do it by themselves. But what makes these three so special? Well, there's a simple way to see if a polygon can tessellate a 2D plane. If one of the interior angles of that polygon is a factor of the number of degrees around a point, then that polygon can tessellate the plane. So 360 is divisible by 90, 120, and 60, but not divisible by 108, 135, or 128.57. And likewise, the number you multiply by to get 360 is the number of polygons around a point. But what if we wanted to tessellate the plane with only 3, 4, or 5 triangles? Well, it is possible, and if you knew what a bag of holding was before this video, then you probably know these types of shapes quite well. If you only put 3 triangles around a point, then obviously it won't tessellate. You just left a huge open gap. But what if you stitch those two sides together? Then the shape would pop out into the third dimension, and it starts to resemble something familiar: a tetrahedron or a D4. With 4 triangles around each point, it becomes an octahedron or a D8, and with 5 triangles around a point, it becomes an icosahedron, or the most important die in D&D, a D20. If you wanted to put 3 squares around a point instead of 4, then you could get a cube or a D6. And if you ignore D10 because it's just weird and doesn't follow any of these rules, and also a D100 since that's just 2 D10s, then there is one die left, the D12. This die is made from wrapping 3 pentagons around a point, which is slightly different from the others since pentagons were not able to tessellate the Euclidean plane, but they nonetheless work here. These shapes, except the D10, are called the Platonic solids, named after Plato who discovered them and their properties. They are basically the most simple shapes you can have in 3 dimensions, and we made them by choosing some points, the points where the polygon's corners meet, and requiring less degrees to fully wrap around that point. But we aren't doing that to all the points in the shapes. The faces are all still completely Euclidean. But if we do require less degrees around each and every point, then it starts to round out into a sphere. That is why this is called spherical geometry. There are two things I should probably make clear before we start exploring this new world of spherical geometry. First, this is not a 3D object, or at least it's just as much a 3D object as a piece of paper. This is still a 2D plane, but stretched around a sphere, so we can move anywhere on the surface, but we can't go into the sphere and we can't just jump off of the sphere. Second, and here's the really confusing part, in that last step where we made the sphere, we took the points that had less space around them and we sort of stretched them out. So now there are still 360 degrees around a point again. It's kind of like a balloon. When you blow it up, the surface area increases, but there is now less rubber in every square inch. So there are still 360 degrees around a point, but there is less space in each degree. Alright, so what makes spherical space different from normal Euclidean space? One of the most prominent things that changes is how lines interact with each other. In normal Euclidean space, there are 3 ways for straight lines to intersect each other. They can intersect once, they can intersect infinitely many times, or they could just not intersect at all. Another way of saying this is that if you have a line and a point, there is one line that goes through that point, but doesn't intersect the other line, and all other lines that go through that point intersect the line once. And the only way for them to intersect infinitely many times is if they are literally the same line, but that's the same no matter what type of space you're in. Now when we look at the other geometries, the options for lines intersecting are a bit different. In spherical geometry, there are no such things as parallel lines. They have to intersect. But wait, what about these two lines? They don't intersect, that is true, but those lines are also not straight. A straight line on a sphere has to loop back on itself and cut the sphere exactly in half. Think of Earth. If you were to walk in a straight line forever, then you would be tracing a sort of equator around the world. But if you were to walk around the North Pole, then clearly you would have to keep turning, and thus you are not walking in a straight line. So there are no parallel lines. But if you're paying attention, then you'd also have noticed that lines can't intersect just once. The only ways for lines to intersect is either infinitely many times or twice. Side note, the two intersection points are exactly opposite each other on the sphere, and they're called antipodes. Antipodes? I don't know, but hopefully that helps you in your next math trivia competition. Something else kind of strange comes from the fact that there are no parallel lines. You see, I like parallel lines. They're neat and tidy, and without them, everything would be crushed if it moved too fast. Let me explain. Due to Newton's third law, if you were to throw a ball in space with no other forces acting on it besides your hand, then once it leaves your hand, it will continue to travel in a straight line forever. And the ball itself is made of a bunch of tiny particles, all moving in their own straight lines, parallel to each other. But if parallel lines aren't allowed, like in spherical space, then that means all of these particles will be gently pushed together at any given instant, essentially applying a compressive force on the object. I say gentle, but that's only if you throw it gently. This force actually increases with speed, which means that for any object, there is a speed that you can throw it at which its structural integrity collapses and it just crushes itself. Another weird thing in spherical space is that the more you move around in it, the more disoriented you become. And I don't mean you just get confused, I mean your actual orientation in space gets changed against your will. Normally you can translate an object all you want and it will never change its angle. But this is a different story in spherical space. Let's try following this arrow. First we'll move the arrow forwards from its point of view, then we'll move it to the right from its point of view, and finally we'll move it back to where it started. But there's something different. The arrow is in the exact same spot as it was before, but now its orientation has turned 90 degrees clockwise. We never actually turned the arrow, but by simply moving it in this space, it turned on its own. The way I originally learned this concept was in a sort of bar-bet type puzzle. The puzzle is, can you start by holding your hand out palm face up and end with holding your hand palm face down without ever actually turning your wrist. And now that we've seen this, the solution is simple. You basically have to treat your hand like a point on a sphere centered at your elbow. So what you do is you bring your hand up to your face, you drop it across your chest, and you extend it out again. Now it's turned 90 degrees. So you just do it again, bring it up to your face, drop it across your chest, and extend it out again. Now you'll have your hand face down, and you never had to turn your wrist. Man, this video is teaching you trivia, bar bets, and advanced geometry. What's next? Oh, it's the really confusing stuff. That's what's next. Alright, okay. Everything we have talked about up to this point has been about spherical geometry. But Hermione's bag doesn't work with spherical geometry. It works with hyperbolic geometry. The reason we went through spherical geometry, though, is that it is much easier to visualize with our Euclidean minds. While two-dimensional spherical geometry looks like this, hyperbolic geometry looks like this, or this. So instead of trying to understand hyperbolic space on its own, we'll utilize a relationship between spherical and hyperbolic space. You see, for everything that is true for spherical space, the exact opposite is true for hyperbolic space. So while spherical geometry is created by taking space out of Euclidean, hyperbolic is made by cramming more space in, which is why it can solve the problem with Hermione's bag. Let's walk through an example in three-dimensional hyperbolic space. In 3D Euclidean space, we can fit 4 cubes around an edge, and we can fit 8 cubes around a corner or a vertex. But if we set up a hyperbolic space in which we can fit 6 cubes around an edge, then how many can we fit around a vertex? It's not as easy as the previous question, because we can't just visualize it this time. Instead, we're going to have to go back to our Euclidean example and come up with a different way of solving it that doesn't involve just looking at it. So what we're going to do is cut off all of the corners of the cubes. This is called truncation. What this does is it changes the question from how many corners touch the center point to simply how many sides does this shape in the middle have? We could just count the sides because we're looking at it, but if we can identify the shape, then we know how many sides it has without even visualizing it. As we saw earlier, all we need to identify a shape is how many sides meet at a corner and what shape those sides are. We know that the number of sides around a corner is 4 because that's how many cubes we can fit around an edge. And the shape of each side is an equilateral triangle since that's what you get when you truncate a cube. So what shape has 4 equilateral triangles around a corner? Well, as we saw earlier, that would be an octahedron. An octahedron has 8 sides, and that means that we can fit 8 cubes around a vertex in Euclidean space. Now we can transfer this idea to our hyperbolic example, and we only need to change one number. The 4 cubes we can fit around an edge to 6 cubes. But what shape has 6 equilateral triangles around a point? Well, the thing is, no shape does. If you remember, there's something special about equilateral triangles in that they can tessellate a 2D plane when they meet 6 to a corner. So the shape in the center is actually the entire 2D Euclidean plane. And how many triangles are on the Euclidean plane? Infinitely many. Which means that the number of cubes we can fit around a vertex in hyperbolic space is an infinite amount. So we can essentially store whatever we want around that point, just like Hermione's bag does. But the connections between hyperbolic space and Harry Potter don't just stop at storage. Because infinitely many cubes can touch a point, that point becomes a hub for transportation. If you are in one of the cubes and you want to get 200 cubes in that direction, then you can just go to the center and come out in the cube you want. This makes the maximum distance you would need to travel to get anywhere in the universe just the distance between you and the nearest corner. So you can travel there practically instantly. Kind of like apparition. Or to use the cubes that we cut the corners off of from earlier, you can go into the shape in the center and come out somewhere completely different. Kind of like the vanishing cabinet. Except the vanishing cabinet has another property. Those who go in don't necessarily have to come out. They could just disappear for a bit. Vanish, if you will. The vanishing cabinet is a more sophisticated form of teleportation than apparition, port keys, or flue powder. A form of transportation in which you can just dawdle around in this sort of world between worlds before you exit. But there are some side effects to teleportation in the Harry Potter universe, and if you're not careful, you could get seriously injured, or worse, very dizzy. And these just so happen to line up with the side effects I mentioned earlier about non-Euclidean space. Remember, the more you move around in spherical geometry, the more you start to turn clockwise. So in hyperbolic geometry, the exact opposite is true. You turn counterclockwise. And what's the one thing consistent across all forms of teleportation in Harry Potter? Spinning. And what was the other side effect of moving around in non-Euclidean space? In spherical geometry, the faster you move, the more you get squeezed. So in hyperbolic geometry, the opposite is true. The faster you move, the more you... Yeah, if you move too fast in hyperbolic geometry, your body will literally be ripped apart limb from limb, or as physicists call it, spaghettification. This is the reason apparition is taught in the 6th year. It is very difficult, and if you mess it up, you will get splinched. So there you have it, hyperbolic geometry. It's how Susan Bones lost a leg and how Hermione carries around all her books. But I guess it wouldn't be the first time Hermione tapped into extremely dangerous magic to fit in a bit of extra learning here and there. Well, now come to think of it, hyperbolic geometry may be able to explain the time turner as well. If you go off of Einstein's assumptions in his theory of general relativity, then that means that space and time are inherently linked, and if space-time exists on a hyperbolic plane, then there's theoretically nothing stopping you from traveling wherever you want and whenever you want. Right? But that is way too complicated for this video that's just about Hermione's bag. In fact, this entire video was too complicated, and I probably said a lot of wrong stuff. I'm not a working mathematician. I'm just a hobbyist. But if you're a professional mathematician, please tell me everything I got wrong in the comment section down there. You can also like this video if you did, and subscribe if you want more like it. I promise, it's not all just heavy math concepts. Next time, I'll do a theory. Yeah, that'll be nice. I won't have to reorganize how my brain perceives reality, and my proofs won't have to come in 2 columns. But until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.
You're gonna fight or you just bump and gum, you hard-boiled turtle slapper?